Shalom.
Shabbat
I'm sure we'll have stragglers coming in. So the Torah portion we're doing this week is Genesis 41:1 through 44:17, Parashat Miketz, which means at the end of. And typical to me, we're not starting in verse 44:1. We talked all week last week about dreams, but dreams are really important to the whole narrative of the Joseph story. And we kind of skimmed over, like, we didn't really discuss him interpreting people's dreams, and I kind of feel like we need to look at the full thread of that. But in the Joseph narrative altogether, I was thinking back this morning in Genesis, let's see, it was 15:13, and the Lord told Abraham that in a land not their own, they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. So what does it take to get these people in a land not their own to be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years? Like a very specific time, very specific date. In this narrative, it's like how the Lord orchestrates stuff. And it's like, the suffering that Joseph went through, which we'll see even in next week's portion, he realizes that everything that he was going through was a setup that the Lord was there. It was hard. And I think the thing that I love about the Joseph story, I told my husband, I almost felt like I was ADHD trying to get through this, because it's like, bunny trail here, bunny trail there. Do we talk about this? Do we talk about that? Symbolisms. We need to talk about symbolism. No, we need to talk about Joseph and the parallel to Yeshua. No, we need to talk about, and I was like really, really having a hard time, like, what do we talk about? We glanced at Joseph's dreams and his family's reaction, but there's so much to this narrative here. So I'm kind of like doing a wide spread between last week's, this week's, and trying not to touch next week's much, just to kind of do a layout of looking at how the Lord kept orchestrating everything through this. And when we're reading these portions, you do want to think about, many people refer to Joseph as the suffering servant. They also refer to Yeshua as the suffering servant. And there were some parallels here of the stuff that Joseph went through that parallels very much of what Yeshua went through with his family and the dynamics that went on there too. So as we're going through this, it's like, it's too much, so I'm trying to narrow myself down, but it was just like, I love symbolisms. I love dreams. I love parallels. I like to connect the dots. Too much. So we're going to kind of try to do a little bit of a sweeping overview. We'll see how far we get with that. So I wanted to start out, though, with the fact that starting in chapter 37, Joseph started out with two dreams, which we mentioned last week. And in these dreams, we see him being exalted. In his dream, we see his siblings bowing down to him. We see him expressing these dreams, and family members don't like it. He gets rebuked for it, and it sparks a spirit of jealousy is going on here now. And it's a divine setup. Again, like, how do you get this family out of the land into Egypt, into slavery for 400 years? How does this narrative move? And we kind of see this dynamic through these dreams. These dreams are kind of like moving this story along. So if you've noticed, we've got Joseph having, narratively, he's only had two dreams, right? Everything else is him interpreting. But each time it was a pattern of two. He has two dreams, Then in prison, he interprets 2 dreams. Then before Pharaoh, it's 2 dreams again. So I think we kind of touched on this last week, but and Joseph even says this, if the Lord gives you that same theme twice, is he trying to get your attention? Is this like something to pay attention to? Because he could have just given Joseph 1 dream. That your brothers bowed down before you. And it could have ended right there. But he gave him 2. And I think that 2 dream parallel, because even with the 2 dreams that the guys had in prison, when you kind of read their dreams, they kind of sound the same, heads being lifted up. I mean, there's like this parallel. Outcomes very different. One lives, one dies. But you're still seeing kind of like this parallel going on here. Because Joseph could have only interpreted 1 dream for the cupbearer, and the cupbearer remembers this really good dream. But to put the highlight that Joseph was not of the ordinary of interpreting dreams, you have 2 in both of them he interprets correctly. Then the same thing, he gets into Pharaoh. Pharaoh has 2 dreams. He interprets them correctly. So we've got this storyline, this dream narrative that's going on that moves him from place to place. But kind of what I want to look at is when he had his first dream, Joseph was the favored son. And when he had the second dream, he was highly favored in prison. And when he had the third dream, it elevated him, or when he interpreted that third set of dreams, it elevated him to a level of favor like he had never known. So he goes from this really good favor with dad to down to prison, down to the depths, but he still has favor. And then he gets up here and we're like really exalted at this point in time. So we kind of see this guy doing this up, down. And the other thing that I loved was the fact that when he goes to Egypt, every time they go to Egypt, they refer to him going down. Like Egypt is not a desirable place. You want to, it had the food, but they're always going down, like to the pit type of feeling with Egypt. And yet we see even like later in the narrative when things get hard on the Israelites, where do they want to go? They want to go back down to Egypt. Like, what is it, this magnetic pull of this place to take you there? But how do we get Joseph into Egypt? I mean, he could have been sold and sent anywhere, but he's sent into Egypt. So I want to kind of take a look at, like, what brought him to this level. And in chapter 37, what does his dad give him? Right, he gets this tunic. Now, how we got to Technicolor Dreamcoat, I don't know.
I know, but I start to hear this song in my head every time I read this.
But it says his dad made him a long sleeve tunic. Now most people only had 1, maybe 2 pairs of clothes, period. Like, so this is pretty significant. This is now his coat, which provokes his brothers to jealousy, right? So I want to look at Joseph's garments first. This is my parallel of looking at garments. So he gets this long-sleeved tunic, and what did this tunic signify? What did it mean? Like, thinking about it, with this tunic, which is obviously not anything like his brother's, it shows, number 1, favoritism, right? Because it says dad gave this to him, not mom made him a tunic, which you'd normally think, yeah, moms will make their kids stuff, but dad gave him this tunic, which absolutely provoked the jealousy. Like, it states in the scriptures, they could not speak shalom to their brothers. Like, this was like the last straw, right? So when his brothers took this tunic away from him, when he came out and gave the bad report, how was that tunic used? Any thoughts on that? What did they do with that?
I mean, they stained it on blood and pretended like he was killed by an animal.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they ripped it.
Yes. It was used to deceive Jacob. And we're going to see a theme of deception here, tied to Jacob's clothing. And to me, that was just like, they took this tunic, they dipped it in blood, they take it to Dad, and they convince Dad that Joseph's dead. They use this to deceive him. So now, when he's in Potiphar's house, because of course, I don't know, like, if he then traveled, like, half naked. Obviously, like, if they took his tunic, what's the guy wearing, right? But he gets into Potiphar's house, and Potiphar clothes him. And he becomes exalted in Potiphar's house. Now he's got this outfit in Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife goes after Joseph, grabs his garment, rips it off of him, holds it in her hand, and what does she do?
Uses it to deceive.
Use it as evidence.
Yes, to deceive. Once again, his garment is used to deceive the person that he has favor with. And so now, once again, he's without a garment, obviously. He ran out, no garment. He's thrown into prison. And while he's in prison, who knows? He's probably wearing rags. You know, we don't know what he's wearing in prison. All we know is that when he gets brought before Pharaoh, they have to clean him up, right?
Yeah.
And once he's exalted by Pharaoh, he's got this new garment. Pharaoh gives him clothes. And how does Joseph use his garments?
To deceive his brothers.
Mm-hmm. Now his brothers, it's like he's an Egyptian. And so his clothing here is being used once again to hide or now he's using it deceptively to hide or disguise his identity. And I was researching this a little bit. Even more than the clothing, if we talk about identity on this, Joseph's identity, going from favored son, going from this slave, going from prisoner, now becoming second to Pharaoh, right? This whole identity, there's a transformation here on his appearance before he goes before Pharaoh. And that's kind of where we get to this point where Pharaoh has these two dreams, right? And he's really stressed out about these dreams. I mean, think about the two dreams he had, okay? The skinny cows, or the fat cows, skinny cows devouring them. The grain, we see this 7 year period. Honestly, when you read these dreams, do they seem that difficult to interpret?
In hindsight.
It's easy for us because we've known this story for years. I mean, if you had a dream like that and you weren't familiar with interpretation of dreams, it would be, wow, what was that? And so he had everybody up, you know, asking them, and nobody could answer.
Yeah. Nobody.
No.
I mean, to me, it's like they weren't hard dreams, but it's like whatever, even if they were trying to interpret this for him, obviously whatever their interpretations were, it was not satisfying Pharaoh. Like he's kind of freaking out on this whole thing. It's like, what do we do with this? And even though in my mind, the dreams didn't seem particularly hard to interpret, nobody could interpret it. And let's start in Genesis 41, which is our portion. Yay, my portion. And it shows, starting at the very beginning, now at the end of 2 whole years, Pharaoh was dreaming. So that 2 whole years speaks of what? Anybody know?
He's been in prison.
They're basing this whole storyline off of Joseph's imprisonment. So, he interpreted for the cupbearer, said, "Remember me."
Yeah.
Did the cupbearer remember him? No.
I mean, way later on, yeah.
Yeah, so he's still hanging out in prison for another 2 years after this, right? So at the end of that 2 years, and I love it, Emma, you've made comments like, God is not really concerned about how long it takes. The Lord is orchestrating this.
He's a lot more patient than I am.
Yeah. Because you figure, I was thinking about the ages on this. Joseph was how old when he was sold? 17, right? By the time he's finally exalted to his position, he's 30 years old. I mean, that is a long time to wait. And I'm going to bunny trail real quick here. During that time, and I know different rabbis have kind of disputed or debated this, do you think that Joseph ever wondered, why didn't my dad come looking for me? I mean,
We had a lot of time to wonder about a lot of things.
but it's like that feeling of nobody's coming and looking for me. Because he's supposed to be the favored son, right? He doesn't know what his brothers have done. He doesn't know they've dipped his garments in blood, took it before dad. So I'm, in the midst of going through all this, there's probably a feeling of abandonment in this from dad. I've also wondered if he had anybody to discuss the things of God with. Because he's like totally isolated. To maintain your faith from age 17 to age 30 with no community. How do you do that? Like, this is extraordinary to me that Joseph was who he was and maintained this integrity level with no good examples around him, nobody speaking into his life to encourage him to be the man that he is. Because we've kind of dinged on him a little bit, like at age 17, should you have told your stories, silly child, this type of thing. So when you think about a 17-year-old teenager going out into the world, I'm kind of thinking like Joseph being pulled out of his father's house and being placed into Egypt, which I'm not going to say they were like, I don't know what Egypt technically looked like at that time, except they weren't worshiping the one true God. So he's been thrown into idol worship for all these years, yet he does not pursue their gods. That blows me away. I mean,
I'd imagine he made his own community, particularly there in prison.
mm-hmm.
I imagine he was witnessing to everybody there, is my imagination at
Mm-hmm.
least. And that they were all coming to faith in the one true God, the Creator. And the baker and the cupbearer, I don't imagine they would have shared, maybe they're desperate to share their dreams, but imagine there was a relationship already there because Joseph saw that they were downtrodden,
Mm-hmm.
and I would think that they already had a relationship where they would communicate with one another. So that's my imagination, is that he did create community. And then later, when he gets married and has kids, they obviously, Friday night prayers to be like Manasseh and Ephraim. They had to be believers too, and didn't worship pagans. And his wife, the sages for sure say that she converted and became a God-fearer. I guess you'd call them then, because you weren't Jews yet. But yeah, so yeah, that's my imagination.
Yeah,
Yes.
they were known as Hebrews then, the
Yeah.
Hebrews.
Mhm.
I would also have to say that Joseph's relationship with God was so, they really don't go into a lot of detail, but his relationship with God had to be so strong to sustain him through everything that he had to go through.
I mean, there seemed like there had to have been some level of hope there. Because people without hope don't go around encouraging other people. Like you said, he recognized that these two guys were down, and he goes to encourage them. I mean, and he's in prison too. But I love this quote. I was reading, I hope I wrote it down. Did I not write it down? No. Yes. Dennis Prager, I was reading his commentary on this. And he quotes a man named Hamilton. I'm not sure who Hamilton is. But I love this quote. It said, "A dream without an accompanying interpretation is like a diagnosis without a prognosis." And that's how the Egyptians felt, like troubled. These, like, why am I getting these dreams? I need an interpretation. And these two guys were down because it's like, I've had these dreams. I'm sure they're telling it to each other. Again, they probably thought, these sound really similar. They weren't. And here comes this little Hebrew guy, well, I guess he's in his late 20s now, that basically says, yeah, God can interpret these. Like, I love the fact that Joseph never takes ownership for interpreting stuff. So there's a level of humility in him. Now, was he humbled through being a slave and a prisoner, you know, like, and I've heard that too, like, well, at 17 years old, he was all puffed up. Then he went through hard stuff, and that's what it took to humble him. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that.
Yeah, I've always struggled with the people saying negative things about Joseph for having told his dreams, because you've got to figure that the brothers had been working on him all along, that he was the baby until Benjamin was born, and he was, you know, the for that long time, the son of the favored wife, the wife that Jacob actually wanted. And so when he told those dreams, he was just saying, wow, you know, I don't want to impugn any negative motivations on him for just saying, wow, in light of what you guys have been saying and doing all these years, and so he was learning humility, which we know from the scriptures that we all have to learn humility, and he was at the same time all along the way cultivating administrative gifts and the gift of being able to hear from the Lord. So those were the things that took him through to the position that the Lord put him in.
It's clear to me, I've wondered, how could, as far as sharing these dreams with his brothers, how could you be that oblivious to the effect this would have on them? So I'm not willing to give him a whole lot of credit. But I can see that if he had done that, if he hadn't ticked him off, he wouldn't have wound up in the pit, and he wouldn't have wound up in Egypt, and he wouldn't have wound up in the position he was in. So God can work with mistakes too. God can work with maybe poor judgment. And maybe he knew all this ahead of time, but whatever reason Joseph had for sharing those dreams, this is where it got him.
Okay.
It seems to be a thread that you see that being a consequence of actually innocently telling the truth or genuinely telling the truth. often the unbelief and the slander and the jealousy, and we see that in so many characters, and even to this day.
Well, and if he hadn't told the dream, I mean, it needed to be documented, right? Like this dream, those two dreams needed to be documented because we get to see the fulfillment of those dreams later on. And him telling his brothers that, like I sat there and I thought, what would it take for these brothers to bow down before this kid that they didn't like? I mean, really, some wanted to kill him. No, we'll go ahead and sell him. They really did not like this brother. And it was jealousy. It was pure jealousy, I'm sure. Plus, Joseph was a tattletale, and that didn't help either.
I wouldn't have liked him either.
Yeah. I mean, seriously, when he showed up to check on them again, it's like, well, here comes the tattletale type of thing, So they really didn't like him.
Yeah. There's also this, I mean, pulling at the parallel to Yeshua thread just a little bit. There's also this pattern kind of that we see of like, even the disciples didn't fully get it, right? When Yeshua is telling them that he's going to die and be raised in 3 days, they have no idea what he's talking about, right? They don't get it, and we're like, this seems very clear. And so, but also, and I'm not saying in that situation it's necessarily a hardening of heart. I think it's just some of it is this is how the Lord accomplishes things. But there is I think we had already said that Joseph's brothers they already had no positive regard for him, and then he's telling them, and so regardless of how we don't have inflection here, so we don't know if Joseph is taunting them and being like, hey guys, you're all gonna bow down to me, which seems like which maybe, or if he's like, wow, I had this dream and this is what I saw and this is what I think it means, and it with more humility, which I think is possible. I think a mixture of both is also possible. It's hard to know, but the outcome, the only thing we can be sure of is the outcome, and it's that his brothers hated him, and even his father doesn't hate him because of it, but he questions him about it. But it just says that he keeps it in mind. And so regardless of his tone, and I think that I don't know that maybe he's naively thinking, oh, this is what's going to help us become closer, is I'm going to have this dream and it's going to be like, hey, everything's going to be okay because I have this calling on my life, or whatever level of revelation they might have. And his brothers just come back at him, and maybe he's surprised. Again, it's all these details we don't have, and so we can imagine this from different angles. And I think that's kind of the fun of it, and that's some of what we're supposed to do with this story. But going back to just this idea of with Yeshua, it's like there is again this pattern of the one who's exalted, has this calling, whatever, being hated by the ones who are closest in some sense, or at least not believed, or there's confusion or whatever. And so I think it's interesting to see that there, and to see, because even again, going back to Yeshua, you're talking about this parallel, when Yeshua dies and goes down, right? What do the disciples do? They run away because they're like, dang it.
Yeah.
They're going to come after us because we said he was the Messiah and now he's dead. So they're like, we're getting out of town. And until Yeshua then reveals himself for who he is clearly to them, which again we have in this story. Sorry if I'm jumping ahead on you too
you're
much.
Good.
But so there is something about, that's one of the ways that it's the people closest often don't see the fullness of what the Lord is doing until later on, arguably until the right point in the story, until they're supposed to. There's this journey for everyone. So I think the brothers are having this journey also, and somebody mentioned, I think it was you brought up the question of did he wonder? He's sitting there for over a decade. Is he sitting there wondering why no one came looking for him? Why his father didn't come looking for him? At the same time, his brothers are carrying this guilt of knowing we didn't actually kill him. He's out there somewhere.
Yeah.
And you know, so
Mhm.
that level of guilt and shame can do a lot to a person too. So we don't have it's one of those that's like, it'd be interesting to have the Joseph and the Judah and the Reuben, you know, like it'd be interesting to have all the different perspectives of like what's going on, what's their process like as all of this is happening and all this waiting is happening and all this time is passing. But anyway,
wondering if they thought maybe my brother would show back up again sometime, like
what's
what
going to
if
happen?
Joseph shows up and actually tells Dad what we did,
Right.
you know, like that would be mind-blowing.
Right.
But when we were talking about the Yeshua parallel here, and we mentioned the garments, like this tunic, Joseph had this tunic that was stripped from him and bloodied and used to deceive. And Yeshua had a beautiful tunic. He had a garment that was stripped from him and you know, purchased, basically, gambled for. We also, there's like these so many little, like, even with Joseph and his older brothers, that jealousy. And we see the jealousy of those who felt like they were in the know. And who is this young man? Because in your 30s, you'd be a young man compared to most of probably the Pharisees and Sadducees and rulers were probably older than him. Who is this guy who thinks he has more knowledge and more to give than what we have here? And that jealousy, it's like we see the threads of jealousy going through with the brothers and Joseph, and we see the threads of jealousy going through with the leaders in Yeshua.
And Yeshua's half-brothers.
Yeah, well,
Yeshua's
yeah,
family
because
didn't
his
believe in
family
him
disappeared on him. Like his brothers weren't hanging out.
Until after.
Yeah, and I love the way The Chosen portrayed that. They have one little scene where Yeshua goes back to do Sukkot, and he asks his mom, so where are my brothers? Well, they're not coming, basically, because they knew you were going to be here. I mean, that family dynamic and his, you know, the weight on him to realize, and we see that, like, recently, my uncle died, and there was a funeral the day before Christmas. It turned out not to be a funeral because two of the brothers are fighting with each other and they won't be in the same room, so one wouldn't come to it if the other one was going to be there. I mean, we've got this kind of a really ugly family dynamic going on. We have an ugly family dynamic going on here with Joseph, and the fact that Yeshua's brothers and siblings aren't there. I mean, so family is messy. It's really messy, and we see that in his. Did you say something?
Well, I was just going to quote the scripture that Yeshua says a prophet is not without honor, except among his own relatives and in his own hometown, I think it is. And we really do see that thread. And even, I'm sure people have shared their stories in their own lives. Just someone who speaks the truth in the reaction. That is often the case.
And that's all Joseph was doing in those first two dreams, delivering the dreams. Like, I never heard him going, no, you're going to bow down before me. I never got that impression when he was sharing that, because he's sure not going to use that attitude with his dad when he's sharing the dream with his dad. I think he's just like this earnest. And I love the fact that we later see that he remembers. Like, these two dreams stuck with him. Like, he carried, before he saw the fulfillment of that, he carried those two dreams for a very long time. Now, we don't ever, I don't know, and I didn't, because it would be the next portion, whether Dad actually bowed down to him when he came before him. Because Dad now knew, and Emma's looking that up.
I think he does.
But the sun and the, you know, the moon and the sun and the moon and everything bowing down before him. I mean, Mom was deceased, so there's a lot of speculations on what would, like, would the sun be Dad and the moon be Mom, but Mom was deceased, you know, so there's, but the core essence of that whole thing was something brought them to the point where these brothers that so disliked this guy would be willing to bow down before him. Not made, they were willing to bow down before him.
They needed something. They
Yeah.
needed food.
Yeah. Now,
And
granted,
a place to live.
they didn't know who he was the first time they bowed down, right? But they still, and they bowed down a second time before him too, when they came back again. So we do see that two dream parallel, that this happened more than one time, which had to have, like, within Joseph think, at least it was true, you know? Because I'm sure he's sitting there thinking, why did I have these dreams, Lord? I'm in exile, you know? What was all of that about? And I would have loved, I mean, that's the thing about the book of Genesis. We don't get the detail we want, you know? I mean, I would have loved if there had been documented conversations that Joseph had with the Lord about stuff, or, like I said, conversations of how the brothers were processing what they did to their brother, except we do see when they're brought before him, they are still carrying a weight of guilt. And everything that is happening to them, they are believing that they are being punished by God for what they did. But there's no evidence that they still had ever told their dad what they did. Maybe if they had repented, if they had confessed, if they had told dad what was going on, but they never did. And carrying the weight of a lie or a sin for that long, unrepentant, unwilling to confess, you know, who cares if it's 2 years or 20-some years?
Do we have any evidence that they ever, even after he was revealed and any of that they divulged the whole story?
Well, they had to eventually, because Joseph got to see his dad.
True.
But no, it never
We don't
says.
know if he got the details, though.
Yeah. And at this point in time, I mean, a lot of these brothers had really kind of fallen out of favor with their dad. Like, other things that they had done.
Yeah.
This is a really strained relationship, especially the only ones that are really named in this is we've got Reuben and all his faults.
But you
And-
made a great sandwich.
You were waiting for that, weren't you? So, you know, we have Reuben who slept with his dad's concubine, and, you know. And then, of course, we got Simeon and Levi who went in and massacred all those people, or all those men, because of the rape of their sister. So we got that going down. We got Judah, and actually a lot of his faults too. We look at the story with Tamar. And so we've got this setup of these older brothers here that I'm sure Jacob is kind of like this frustrated dad. Like, all of us who have adult kids look at decisions our children are making in their lives, and we're like, you know, I mean, some of us are more fortunate than others that we haven't had kids that have made really bad decisions, but there are times that you kind of look at, like, their life and you're going, are you making the right decision? Are you moving in the right way? You know, and my heart goes out to Jacob, because I'm looking at what this guy is doing, living with these kids, trying to teach them about the one true God, which they are going to be the carriers of that, and the moral failures that are happening is intense. And then we have Joseph, who's not growing up amongst all that, and he's not having moral failures. That to me is, again, amazing. So, okay, we'll move on. So, when Pharaoh has this dream, and I'm going to look at Genesis 41:14, starting there. Okay, so right before that, the cupbearer tells Pharaoh about Joseph. Then Pharaoh sent and called for Joseph. So they quickly fetched him from the pit. So they're actually calling prison a pit in this. So here he is in the pit again, being pulled out of a pit. And it says, and he was shaved, he changed his clothes, and came to Pharaoh. Now I think this line is more about the changing of appearance, has more to do than somebody just getting cleaned up for court. You know, like I was sitting there, like when somebody's in jail and they look, okay, they're going to go before the judge, so let's get them cleaned up. Here we have a Hebrew that is going to go before Pharaoh. And Hebrews are not thought well of by this group of people. I mean, they're lesser. To me, it looks like when they shaved him, they cut his hair, they put clothes, I think they were trying to present somebody that looked a little more Egyptian in front of Pharaoh.
Yeah, I really, that contrast in the cultural expectations of personal appearance are a big thread throughout the story. That's why the brothers didn't recognize Joseph when they came and needed bread, because he looked like an Egyptian. And that thread is repeated throughout the story.
And looking like an Egyptian would be more than just his clothing, right? I mean, his appearance was altered here. In a sense, his identity was altered. He went from being, in people's eyes, a Hebrew to being an Egyptian now in people's eyes. But in order for Pharaoh to want to receive counsel from somebody, they altered his appearance in a lot of ways.
It was necessary for him to be socially accepted.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, and he would not have been able to be elevated to the status that he was, where people would come to him and receive information from him, receive instructions from him, if he looked like a Hebrew. They just wouldn't have, because there was just that lack of...
A lot of that, I think, was probably self-preservation on the part of the guys that suggested, well, why don't you talk to this guy? And then you present him with some guy that just came out of a dumpster. What do you think the Pharaoh's gonna?
Yeah. Yeah.
And culturally, it's the same thing today. If an Islamist in his full tribal-looking garb came in here, we would be very slow to hear anything that he would have to say.
True. True. So now we get to the fun part. Joseph interprets this dream. And I love, there's a couple little things in this that I like. Okay, so his appearance has been altered. He's brought before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh tells him, he says to Joseph, I dreamed a dream and there's no one to interpret it. I heard about you. It says that you can listen to a dream and interpret it. Then Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it's not within me. God will answer shalom for Pharaoh. So let's think about that a minute. Joseph tells Pharaoh that God's going to answer with shalom for him. Now, when Joseph interpreted the dream for the baker, was that a interpretation of shalom to the baker? No, he died, right? So here, before Joseph even hears this, he's already telling Pharaoh that God's going to answer with shalom to you. Now, he could have meant he's going to put your heart at ease because you're really distressed because you don't know the answer to your dreams. Or he could just be telling him, God's going to tell you some good stuff before he even hears the dreams. That's like this confidence that Joseph has, that he's been brought before this man because God has something good to tell him, has shalom or peace to tell Pharaoh. And it seems almost like audacity on one side. Like, there's a boldness to him. Even standing, there's a humility, but there is a bluntness to Joseph that I really like or appreciate. He didn't cower. He stands before him and he's very direct with him. To Pharaoh, of all people. And so Pharaoh tells him the dream, or both dreams, goes through it. And it says, starting in 25, then Joseph says to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dream is one. God has told Pharaoh what he is about to do. So he's prophesying to him, right? So tells him the meaning of it all. And then we'll jump down to, lets him know about the 7 years of famine, 7 years of abundance. And then starting in verse 32. Now as for repeating Pharaoh's dream twice, it is because the matter has been settled by God, and God will quickly make it happen. Now there is one thing that I read about when he's referring to God with Pharaoh. He's using the phrase Elohim, but he's using it in a generic form. So he's not drilling the one true God message at Pharaoh on this. He's just using that in a generic form, in a sense that Pharaoh's going to receive. Because if Joseph starts going way out here on the let me introduce you to something totally new thing, it's not going to work with Pharaoh at this point. I mean, who's Pharaoh supposed to be but a god, right? So he keeps telling him God, he is letting him know it's God, but he's not specifying the one true God in this teachings from when you go back and look at the verbiage on that. And so it allows it to be more palatable to Pharaoh. Jim?
It reminds me when Moses approached a later Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said, well, I don't know this God of yours. So Moses had a mission that was different, I guess. So he didn't quite, wasn't tactful as maybe Joseph was here.
Well, Moses was instigating conflict. Seems like Joseph is instigating peace on this, a help. I was also thinking about, like, the mandate, the call for the Hebrew people, with the seed and the blessing. They are to be a blessing to the nations, right? Joseph is going to be a massive blessing to the nation of Egypt right now, to a land that's not his own. Yeah, his brothers and his dad are going to get blessed out of it. But here's a whole people group that could have starved to death. And Egypt is getting saved through this. So there's a bigger story going on just than Joseph getting reconciled to his brothers. There's a whole restoration. There's a favor that comes from all of this. There's a dwelling in the land for 400 years, starting out good and ending up what it ended up. But I think that's really important to look at the level of starting this out on a high note, so to speak, not a conflict. By the time Moses is on there, it's time for these people to get out of this land. So how do you get the people out of the land? By conflict. So that's when I love this. It's like, how does God get people into this land? Now how does God get people out of this land? And you look at Joseph versus Moses' personalities, missions, and interactions with Pharaoh's, very different.
Can I say one thing? So I think I like what you're saying, because a big part of the greater narrative that's going on here and the conflict that's created has to do with how the Egyptians are perceiving the God of Israel. So yes, Joseph is being presented to Pharaoh here, cleaned up, probably looking more Egyptian, but Pharaoh still knows he's not.
Yeah.
Like, Pharaoh is not fooled. Like, Pharaoh knows that he's a Hebrew. And so, and culturally it's understood that different people groups have different gods. And so, like, yes, Joseph is probably using a generic term for God. But at this point, his God is beneficial to Pharaoh. So of course Pharaoh is going to be willing to be like, sure, if your God's going to help me out, bring him on in. We'll add him to the group. And and I think there's wisdom in Joseph not saying, but now you can only worship this God at this point. That's not where we are in the narrative yet. You know, I don't think that Joseph is being overly deceptive about it. He is speaking of his God. But you know, it's clear that it's the favor of the God of Israel that is going to make all of this be okay. And then by the time, you know, over time this of course shifts, and by the time we get to Moses and this conflict, it is this, our God is the one true God. We can not worship any other gods, and it creates this conflict, which then results in the Exodus and like you said, moving the story forward. But at this point, all we really have is that the God that Joseph serves is going to save the world. Right? It's essentially what's happening, right? And that's enough at this point. That fact is enough, and of course Pharaoh's going to accept that, because what's the alternative? The alternative is that the Egyptian people all die too, right? The opposite is that everybody dies, you know? And so, so it's this interesting thing of like, but that's why it's so easily accepted, is that Pharaoh would assume that Joseph would have another God that he's serving because he's from a different people group. And Joseph coming in and saying, but my God is giving me the information that's gonna make this go well. And so of course Pharaoh's like, this is great. I want that God on my side. You know, but then we see the shift over time. So it's interesting to see how that happens.
And when you think of all the gods that the people of Egypt worshipped anyways, what's one more God?
Right.
You know, like I've shared before, I have a friend in India that she witnesses to people. They'll receive Yeshua or Jesus, and they're more than happy to stick his statue up on the mantle along with all the other gods that they serve. It's like, this God is for this, and this God is for that, and who knows, they could just be looking at it going, okay, this is the God that provides food right now. You know, I mean, so whatever's going to help us, we're going to go for. But here's the part that's super cool. Everything's super cool. And so then he tells them, now let Pharaoh select a man discerning and wise, and set him in authority over the land of Egypt. Now, Pharaoh asked Joseph to interpret his dream. Did he ask Joseph to counsel him? Did he ask this Hebrew slave that just came out of prison, give me wise counsel and tell me what to do now?
Why should he?
It's called seizing the moment.
Yeah, so here he is again, this thinking of the status here, but now he's advising Pharaoh. Let Pharaoh act by appointing administrators over the land and take 1/5 of the portion from the land of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. Then let them gather all the food from these good years that are coming, and let them store up grain under Pharaoh's hand as food for the cities, so they may preserve it. Let the food be held in a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine that is coming upon the land of Egypt. Then the land will not be annihilated by the famine. Now the plan seemed good in the eyes of Pharaoh, as well as all his servants. So, I mean, he really broke down the details on this. This is how you need to do it. And it says, can a man like this be found, one in whom is God's Spirit? That's the question now. It's like, this is good. How do we find a man in whom is God's Spirit? And it is, Ruach is used in this. Like, this is one of the few times where this is the Spirit of God that Pharaoh's referring to. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. This is still amazing. This is a slave that he is saying this to. You will be over my house. and all my people will pay homage to you. Only in relationship to the throne will I be greater than you. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I appoint you over the whole land of Egypt. The whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, clothed him with fine linen garments, and put a chain of gold around his neck. Then now, the chain of gold, there's a lot of, like it could have been one of those big collar things, but it signified a level of almost rulership. I mean, only rulers, those in major authority, wore this type of garb. So when people saw him coming, that's why I like the idea of the collar. Like when people saw him coming, it wasn't like, let's look for that little chain. No, here he is. This is big as life. Here comes Joseph.
Like Mr. T.
Yeah, Mr. T. Then he had him ride in a chariot as in second command, the one that belonged to him, and he called out before him, kneel down. So here we go again. They're kneeling before him. So he appointed over him the whole land of Egypt. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission, no one will lift up his hand or his foot in the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh gave him a new name, which I'm not going to try to pronounce because I'll just butcher it. Now the interesting thing on this new name, this Zaphenath-Paneah, there you go, he never called him that again in the scriptures. Like when he talked to Joseph, he still called him Joseph, even though he gave him a new name, I'm sure for like status purpose or relational purpose, but he still respected Joseph enough to still call Joseph Joseph when he talked to him. And then he said he gave him the daughter of Potiphera, not Potiphar, and she was the daughter of a priest. So here we've still got this idol thing going on here. And it says, then Joseph went out in charge of the land of Egypt, and he was 30 years old when he began serving as a representative. So we had a lot happen here, like a major shift from prison to basically like a prince. That whole transformation that happened, that setup that only God could have orchestrated. Only God. I mean, I don't know how anybody could read this story and not think, how did that happen except by the power of God was this set up. But here he is, now he's ruling. And he rules for 7 years. And then the famine hits. And now we're at the point where Joseph gets to meet up with his brothers. But this famine hits, and starting in chapter 42, now Jacob saw, finally we get back to Jacob. Like, it's like, you know, have you ever watched those shows where you see this big story and then all of a sudden they like, oh, and let's go back over to what's happening with this person over here. It's kind of like we recently rewatched through the whole Lord of the Rings, and you see this big story plot, and then all of a sudden they jump back over to Frodo and Sam, and I was like, man, I almost forgot about them. I was so enthralled over in this one. So now we're back to Jacob again. Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, so Jacob said to his sons, why are you looking at each other? That to me is like, I love that. Like, why are you looking at each other? Look, I heard that there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some grain for us, so that we will live and not die. And it's like, the fact that he had to tell them to do that. Again, these are grown men, and they're just, what do we do? What do we do? You know, it's kind of what it felt like, you know, and he's like, what are you looking at each other? Come on, guys, you know. So Joseph's brothers went down, 10 of them, to buy grain from Egypt. But Benjamin, Joseph's brother, Jacob did not send, for he said an accident might happen to him. Okay, we'll stop right there a minute. Why would he say that? Do you think there's a distrust?
Well, yeah, his only brother was supposedly killed by an animal, so, you know, something might happen to him. I mean, it was a very natural way of protecting him.
It makes me wonder, do you think, like, Jacob was kind of connecting the dots here? Like, obviously, he was concerned for Benjamin's life with his brothers. Like, he didn't, that was like, if I send my son with you, an accident might happen. That's like Dad saying, I don't trust you with your brother. Which makes me wonder, like, did Jacob question still, was this initial story of what happened to Joseph really what happened? There's a level of distrust going on there, big time, between Jacob and these sons. And it's sad, like, I can't even imagine having to think, I'm not going to let my youngest kid go out with their older brothers and sisters because I don't trust what they'll do or won't do for their sibling.
What did he have to gain by calling him a liar?
Yeah. Answer that.
Nothing.
Nothing. Yeah. So the sons of Israel went down to buy grain among the others who were coming because the famine of the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the provider of grain for all the people of the earth. So you had to go through Joseph. Couldn't go to Joseph second in hand. You had to go through Joseph. Then Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces to the ground. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he made himself unrecognizable to them. Then he spoke harshly and said to them, "Where have you come from?" Spoke harshly to them. So, what do you think? Do you think Joseph's still harboring some anger with his brothers?
Well, he doesn't trust them because they've given him no reason to trust them. So, you know, he's definitely holding them at arm's length, but he's going to try to get as much information out of them as he can.
But did he have to be harsh to do that?
Yeah, I think he's trying to keep them off balance.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Authorities do that.
Yeah. True.
Police do that. Leaders do that. Like keep the audience off balance, so that you can get. It's easier to get accurate information.
True.
When the person is sort of backpedaling or caught on the defensive. So, yeah, I don't think that he was still genuinely angry with him or anything. But that's my opinion. I think he's working something here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. He's just setting up the stage to find out if they've repented about their attitudes, about their other brother, son of Rachel.
Yeah.
That maybe Jacob has repented, is not favoring Benjamin like he did Joseph. I don't know, because we don't see that in the text, I don't think. But
Yeah.
so he's just setting up this whole thing to find out whether they've repented and how will they, and so they have to decide, are we going to bow down to this man that's dealt with us so harshly because we don't want to get hurt in trouble, or do we defend Benjamin and protect him? Of course, that's next week.
Yeah.
But so it's just setting up this ruse that that's part of the story, you know. They have to look at him as someone that they don't want to cross.
Yeah.
So where will we go to, how far will we go to eventually protect and defend our brother?
You see?
Yeah, I'd like to give you information, very important information. 2 minutes before we started talking about Joseph's brothers in the story, when Pharaoh gave the name to Joseph, Tzefnat Paneach in Hebrew.
Okay.
Well, Pharaoh did not speak Hebrew. Okay, I remember when I talked to Kenny about speaking in tongues and some words coming up and from the Holy Spirit, and we don't know what we're saying, but it has significance to the outcome of the word. So what Pharaoh said there, he did not speak Hebrew, but he gave him Hebrew name.
That was a Hebrew name. Okay.
He gave him a Hebrew name, but he didn't know Hebrew. He didn't speak Hebrew, Pharaoh. So, but you know what the words mean there? It's a code breaker. Code breaker. Not just code breaker in the cyber war that we have today, or if you try to open a combination of a safe, you know. It's like spiritual mystery, classified thing that you break. So his name, he gave it to him in a Hebrew name. Still we use those Hebrew words today forever. It's the most ancient words that we use in our language every day. It's code breaker, not just physical technology, but it's a spiritual code breaker.
So like a dream interpreter, code breaker.
Right.
That's good.
That's his
Thanks for
name.
sharing
He
that.
gave him code breaker in a Hebrew word. By the time he does not speak Hebrew, that's the interesting thing.
That's very cool.
So I looked it up real quick. At least this, so I just Googled it. It's not saying what source this is coming from, if it's like Bible Hub or whatever. But here, that the name means God speaks and he lives. So I'm not sure if it's saying like God spoke to him and he lived, or God spoke and God lives. I'm not really sure. It doesn't offer a whole bunch more. It just says that, again, that's what Google said that
Yeah.
Joseph's
Cool.
Egyptian name meant.
I think the name thing is really important because we also see that Joseph had 2 sons. The names of his sons are really important too. And that first one, Manasseh, says, because God has caused me to forget all my trouble in all my father's house, which the conversation we kind of already had about, you know, in one sense, okay, if he's helping me forget all my trouble, he's comforting him, right? This child is helping him forget that. Forgetting my father's house, part of that had once again to do with the debate of, did Joseph believed that his father had abandoned him, therefore he was bringing to the point where he could forget his father's house. Because again, Joseph didn't know why dad hadn't come looking for him. So this was like, that first child is speaking to his healing of his heart and his perspective on his relationship to his father's house. Like, and it's important because people carry stuff for a really long time, and it feels like the birth of this child is Joseph letting something go that he's been carrying for a long time. A hurt, a weight, a betrayal, all of that. He put that into the name of his firstborn child. So first we get the healing, then the second child is born, Ephraim, and it says, because God has made me fruitful in the land of my oppression. So it's like, I'm going to forgive, and with the second child, I'm going to be settled now in where I'm at. It's like he's finally like, God's made me fruitful here. This has been an oppressive land, but God is good, you know? And so by the time his brothers had arrived before him, it seems like Joseph has worked out a lot of these emotional conflicts that he had been going through on this just because of what he named his kids. And now he's ready to basically, through the series of interactions he has with his brothers going forward, these are all tests now. Like he's testing his brothers. He's trying to get the information out of them. He's trying to see where their heart is. He's going forward, he's trying to see, will you protect your brother if I provoke you to jealousy about him by giving him 5 times more food than what was set before you? Because when Benjamin comes back, he gives Benjamin 5 times more food than he sets before the other brothers. And it's like this whole setup again. You were jealous because of my coat, so therefore you took me from my dad. If I make you jealous of what I'm doing for Benjamin, will this provoke this same type of thing about your brother? And he really is testing, like, are you willing to protect your brothers now? Even at the beginning, when he first interacts with them, when they get there, and before he throws them into jail for 3 days, he tells them that all but one will stay here and one will go down. But then 3 days later, he says one will stay here and the rest of you will go home. And I sat and wondered, like at first when he saw him, if he was provoked to this, okay, I'm going to keep all but one of you. One of you gets to go back to your dad, get Benjamin, bring him back here, and the rest of you have to stay here. But then after they were sitting in there for 3 days, he comes back and says, okay, one of you will stay here, and the rest of you will go down. What was the change of heart on that? What was within that 3 days that we switched from 9 stay to only 1 stay? And Joseph's the one that picked the one to stay. He picked Simeon. Why Simeon? And I have theories. And initially, I think he probably would have picked Reuben if he hadn't heard the brothers' conversations. That Reuben did come back to rescue his brother and they had sold him. Otherwise, he may have kept the firstborn. That would make sense. So let's keep the next in line, Even when he set them up to eat and they marveled because he knew their birth order. It's like he was putting subtle hints out there that they weren't catching. Like, in a sense, like if I put them in birth order, will they know that I know who they are? There's just all these little tests that he was doing, I felt like that was trying to set up for the big reveal. And when we hit the big reveal, that's huge. But in his interactions now with his brothers in chapter 43, 44, going forward, he puts out little tests for them to see where their hearts are now so that he can get it solidified within himself I feel like what had even happened to him and why it happened, and that this wouldn't happen again to Benjamin. So, I think we'll call it quits. Thanks for sharing with me, guys, and I'll go ahead and close us in prayer. So, Lord, we thank you for stories like Joseph, and God, we thank you they're not just stories. We thank you for examples of people like Joseph who stayed steadfast to you in the midst of adversity. Lord, we thank you that you can bring healing, and you show that you can bring healing to family dynamics by reading stories like this. Lord, we just ask that your power would be made manifest within hard family dynamics. And Lord, we just ask that your presence would just be upon us today. We ask that your anointing would be on whoever speaks, whoever prays, whoever the worship team, and just let your spirit flow throughout this service. We give you all the glory and honor and praise in Yeshua's name. Amen.